So, welcome to the first Howard Liddell Memorial Lecture. Howard was acknowledged as one of the leading ecological design architects in Europe, with 40 years' experience at the forefront of sustainable design. Co-founder and first chair of CEDA, I think from 91 to 93, I chaired from 99 to 2001. He would be completely delighted to see CEDA in such good health. Lest we forget, he was also a dad and a granddad. We shouldn't forget that. In Howard's absence, however, I do not intend to use this opportunity to discuss his legacy. His buildings, his teaching, his students, and his colleagues are able to do that. If there is an appetite for it, then perhaps there's another opportunity to have that kind of discussion. Neither do I anticipate that future memorial lectures will focus on Howard. But I would like on this occasion to discuss what Howard was working on when he died, to give voice to unfinished business and some of what gave him his moral compass, if you will bear with me. Howard and I never failed to acknowledge our influence on each other. From when we met in September 1995 and married 5 weeks later, yes, we had a creative kind of push me, pull you edge to our work, and that resulted in a synergy of thoughts and ideas. He was an architect. Actually, I'm not a chartered architect, I'm a chartered engineer, as it happened. And this lecture will be loyal to the hybrid nature of much that we did together. Our work together allowed us to develop a fabulously enjoyable business partnership based on our mutual interest in research and design in pursuit of innovation in the built environment. It allowed us to then go on and evaluate and learn from that experience, both the good and the bad, and to disseminate what we learned, the good and the bad. We sought and increasingly got involved in capacity building and training so that other people could learn from the innovation and take forward the good messages, preferably without making the mistakes that we made too often. And then that would feed us into future research. So we would take time out, twice a year perhaps, go away and think about all the things that needed to be done. And then out of that we'd think about the things that actually we wanted to do. And then from that, we'd think about things that people might actually pay us to do. Most of it. And we had a complete ball. It was fabulous. It was the most superb business model. When Howard died, there were very many kind tributes to his career and his influence. A magnesium taper burning with indignation at the self-destructive hubris of humankind comes to mind. But since then, particularly in relation to this idea of a memorial lecture, the dominant word has been conscience. Many people still clearly view Howard as a kind of angel on our shoulder, simultaneously kicking us in the arse, encouraging us to be more radical, greener, and have more heart. One of Howard's notable characteristics was his passion to acknowledge the influences on him. From the eco-anarchism of the street farmers, who opened his eyes to the radical approaches to eco-design and eco-minimalism. This was about eco-cities. Howard was never one for eco-houses or eco-villages. He wanted to deal with the whole thing, the whole picture. And that was his starting point. He also very much acknowledged his colleagues, his students, the eco-city kids that he learnt such a lot from, and his friends, particularly in CEDA and in Gaia International, many of whom have very significant impact and inroads in this agenda themselves. And his forebears. Perhaps the most profound influence on him was Patrick Geddes. He allows me to set the scene for what follows. He was a famous polymath, innovator, urban planner, sociologist. He was certainly no slouch. Throughout his career, Howard revisited, updated, and revitalised the working models and planning tools of Geddes. During his time as part of the Aberfeldy community in the 1970s, he used the Valley section as a community development tool. That's another story. And Geddes, of course, was himself a great populariser of the good idea. Think globally, act locally. He popularised so much that people still think he invented it. He didn't. The triple bottom line of economy, society and economy in our environment became the Geddesian folk, work and place. And it seems that everybody is able to make this link, takes this kind of linkages between these things as the norm, except me, because actually I'm not very sure that it's an automatic connection. As I say, within our office, it became the Gaia three-legged stool, the three pillars of sustainable development, symbolised in this way because we desperately wanted to communicate that if any aspect of this doesn't work, then the whole thing is going to fall down. And one of the things I think Geddes might have admired in the approach that we took was something like the project at Toll House at Fairfield, the last project that Howard did at Fairfield. And there we looked at the three aspects, the folk, work and place, with a view to making a healthy housing intervention. This was about low allergy, affordable housing. So we looked at the kind of influence we could make on the environmental side, and that was to minimise pollutants, make healthy housing. The impact of that was actually to create a social output, which was this healthy housing. And when you then start to analyse it in similar projects which are looking at making real fundamental changes that deal with the whole three-legged stool, you find that actually you get reduced medical costs. So you are actually getting projects where you're getting healthy housing on prescription. Now that's a kind of sustainable development model. And there are a few more appearing like that. And that, of course, the economic argument is the one that then allows you to get on board the politicians, allow you to actually make these kind of innovations. That said, it was at the same, we built it at the same price as everybody else's housing, so it shouldn't have been an argument anyway. Geddes understood sustainable development as a process, not as an act. Geddes was also known for his thinking machines, developed during a period of his illness. And Geddes used them to work through synergies in sciences and concepts. Howard often also used these thinking machines to help in making connections and defining processes and actions towards a holistic approach. And to direct, as Geddes before him had, thoughts and deeds and acts. Geddes honed them into mantra-like models of holistic development. And so did Howard. Long nights in Aberfeldy. It was, above all, the environment that Howard and I worked in, one where we used divergent thinking, exploring and seeking out possibilities, integrating, leaving time for second and third thoughts. And perhaps this is something that I notice at the moment quite clearly. It's a kind of lack of direction that I feel is emerging in the kind of events that I now go to. I went to a cross-party group on the environment at the Parliament on one day last week. I don't know if anybody else was there. There's a lot of organisations involved in the built environment seeking to write a manifesto. They all were sitting there, their own little niches, all burying away, talking about their own little stuff, divided by a complete common lack of insight that actually might be the foundation for some kind of manifesto. Hardly a recipe. Anyway, this divergent environment frustrated us enormously, because what we saw from our perspective was the antidote to that, the way that everybody wanted to funnel aspects and approaches to sustainability into something simple that they could handle and degrade the term. By degrading the term, they were also degrading the kind of response that was required in order to deal with it. So you looked at the big challenge, folk, work, place, communities, pollution, biodiversity, health, resources, And what happened, first and foremost, was people focus on the resources bit. And then they focus on the energy bit, as if that's even bigger than the resources bit. And then they would focus on the carbon bit, because that's even easier to handle. Which is fine for people who actually want simple answers, but not if you're actually looking for good, long-term, sustainable solutions. So, Howard came up with the C word as the response. His biggest frustration was reserved for the silver bullet market response. Some piece of eco-bling, a turbine, solar collector, or the God Passive House. Yes, as if God was a noun. He gave the eco-bling on his design work exactly the time it deserved within the panoply of all the issues that needed to be considered. No more and no less. It's a big agenda. And what you probably, many of you will know, is that his response was to write eco-minimalism, the antidote to eco-bling. Eco-minimalism, even at that stage, was only part of the story. He had another book to write. From the point at which I suggested that people talk about sustainability like 10-year-olds talk about sex, which is a lot, but not with any great insight and not with any inclination to ask anybody who might know anything about it, we decided to avoid the S word. Actually, what we did was we decided to go out for a drink to celebrate this and then to avoid the S word. And instead we decided we'd talk about the D word, development. Making tomorrow better than today appeared to be a much more comprehensible ambition, one less prone to abuse and degradation, because you could simply do the sums. How many more fish are there in the oceans? How much more pollution is there in the air? We were great believers in doing the sums. And hence were born Howard's Carbon-Free Lectures. An opportunity to talk about all the underrepresented stuff in real development that nobody really wants to talk about. And Howard wished to do this by paying respects to pioneers who had influenced him. Geddes has been introduced, and I will introduce the others in due course. Before I do that, I want to nail this development thing. I just want to nail this development thing. So I'm going to take you back. I'm going to take you back to 1968 and the Club of Rome. When 30 influential people got together to talk about things that they thought were relevant to all nations, but outweighed the ability of any individual nation to deal with. Surprisingly, I think we can safely recognise all of them as unresolved issues of today. Only 47 years on, gosh, we know how to progress, don't we? It was, that said, a very interesting and an optimistic time. We'd just gone through the Green Revolution. Food production had increased by a third in the world, and there was a massive technological optimism. This idea that we could put more and more demands on the Earth, and the Earth's ability to sustain us would also expand in order to meet that demand. This kind of exponential increase. Nice if it was so. The Club of Rome commissioned some research and identified that this growth in production was actually associated with an unsupportable growth in pesticide use, in equipment, and in nitrates. The authors speculated that this was unsustainable. They also identified that there were very few examples in nature of this kind of exponential growth, like none. Even the universe expands and contracts, as far as we know. And they contrasted this assumption of exponential growth with the way systems appear to behave in nature. What they identified was systems tend to oscillate. A population might expand until its food supplies run out, and then it will contract. So a bit like the relationship between mice and owls over a period of years. In a bad winter, the mice can hide underneath the snow, stay nice and warm, and their population is safe from the owls who can't get at them, and their survival rates will fall off. A warmer winter to follow will be characterised by a very small number of owls with a feast of mice, which will assist the owl population to go back and recover. So that seemed to them a much more normal experience. In this, what I experienced as the first ever systems approach to looking at our environment. And when I referred to this as a systems approach, it was another good conversation, because I'm an engineer. And I actually commented that this bears a resemblance to the first stage of what I, as a mechanical engineer, would see as a test of resilience. That oscillation is within the realm of where a material or a system responds to stresses and strains, but can always go back to where it first started. It's called the elastic region. The Club of Rome expressed a concern that we might overexploit a resource and therefore overshoot our ability to recover. Well, not surprisingly, there's an interesting parallel with the second phase of testing. When you've gone beyond what's called its yield strength, it's what in resilience terms is called plasticity, where a material becomes permanently distorted and it can't ever go back to what it was like before. In fact, at this stage, you're not even sure how much stress and strain you can put on it before total failure and it's broke. So, as a mechanical engineer faced with an unknown system, you have to test it to destruction to see how it will behave. Now, as a model for what we're doing with Earth systems, I think that's a good reason to be concerned. And because the Club of Rome guys were pretty smart, and they had a few engineers as well, they actually suggested that what we ought to do is put in place some kind of stewardship and understanding, put the resources behind understanding what the limit to the Earth's ability to sustain us might be, and to make sure that we lived within those boundaries. Seems sensible enough. It became known as the Limits to Growth Report. It found some favour in a few quarters. It's still demonised in some. Look it up, it's quite weird. So really not substantive favour. And one wonders whether or not we've heeded this 50-year-old wisdom. What it allows me to do is introduce hero number 2. Yeah, of course. Internationally influential, a statistician, an economist. Actually, both Howard and I probably were introduced to him independently in the 70s through his proposals for human scale, decentralised, appropriate technologies. That was my degree, engineering design and appropriate technology, chicken shit and windmills to others. Yes, author of Small is Beautiful, Good Work and a number of other things. The concerns expressed by Schumacher have not been addressed in the intervening period. We've got vast increases in trade and consumption of every type of resource, food stocks, minerals and fuels. And indeed, ongoing research by the Club of Rome indicates that 40 years on, the limits to growth forecasts have indeed been vindicated, and we're now indeed way beyond the limits. Shame when we had the opportunity to do something about it so long ago. But remember, Schumacher was an economist first and foremost, and his concerns were also about the economy and how we dealt with that. So, a fact to ponder about the economy is, if you invested a penny in 1 AD at 4% interest, you would, by 1821, be able to buy a solid gold earth. By 1839, you would be able to have 2 solid gold earths. And by 2003, you'd have over 1,200. It doesn't feel sustainable, does it? It just feels wrong. In fact, I worked out yesterday that by 2015, you'd be able to buy 2015, which is a fantastic coincidence. I couldn't believe it myself. I was looking, I know it can't be right. A doubling every 17 years. I think what Schumacher would have been charmed by are the ideas articulated so well by people like the late Margaret Kennedy, a member of Gaia International, Bernard Leitner, promoting a trend to new economics. Prepared to talk about the wrecking ball of compound interest, and Fritz Schumacher would have been excited that the Club of Rome is still onto these issues. There is a promotion of people money. There are complementary currencies which are circulating within regional economies. There are transition towns, and there is Occupy Wall Street, of course. All a fabulously promising, coherent, emerging concept. But it's a bit marginal, isn't it? Given you know, 1,200, 2,115 gold Earths. It's just a bit marginal stuff. I think Schumacher would have also appreciated the extent to which a development model that pursues gross national happiness before gross national product has been disseminated and more widely adopted. It was actually introduced by the incoming very young King of Bhutan, and it's developed a following. There is an EU directive now which requires an indicator of happiness to be produced. Again, derided in many quarters, but it makes very good reading. And in fact, there's evidence now, good evidence, that life satisfaction is enhanced up to a point by increasing prosperity, but then surprisingly it kind of levels off. Apparently, emotional prosperity just stagnates when you're rich enough. How surprising is that? A decoupling of life satisfaction from purchasing power. Would Schumacher feel we were making progress? I think he would. I think he'd think we were making slow progress. And I think he'd probably think it was an intellectual process, and I think he'd probably think we were being too clever to be wise. Schumacher was also involved in the socially useful product debate, a lovely book called Good Work. The history of this, I'm going to briefly mention. In 1976, Lucas Aerospace had a fight in order to start developing useful work. Lucas Aerospace could close down their factory, which was essentially armaments, and that would involve making all of their workforce redundant, or they could follow the initiative of their trade union and engage the workers in creative manufacturing. The union had got together a whole load of ideas based on the imagination and skills of these very, very skilled workers. And they'd come up with plans to make kidney machines and bicycles and loads of stuff. The management closed it down. Okay, so it never really did take off in the UK. It's a little bit of a mention, you know, a thought for whether or not, you know, the 9 million quid going into the steel industry could be used in a productive way, you know, at a few thousand pounds a job, rather than the way that I'm sure it will turn out, but I'll try and stay positive. But rapidly moving on, a whole few years, to the Stockholm Conference in 1972. 117 nations, I believe, got together to talk about what would happen if the then current model of development by Western nations was replicated. What would be the effects on pollution and biodiversity and all of these things? As you can imagine, the developing nations were initially, shall we say, unimpressed at what they saw as moralising and a restraint on development by people who frankly have grown very fat and rich on polluting the earth to date. You would be, wouldn't you? What actually happened was that before that conference finished, there was general agreement that it was actually pragmatic and it was in everybody's self-interest to have cooperation on these really important issues internationally. And there was also a huge recognition of the value of poverty alleviation in prioritising environmental issues and protecting the environment. There were some really important decisions that came out in 1972. It resulted in the publication of Only One Earth by Barbara Ward and René Dubois. Barbara was a good friend of Fritz, not surprisingly. They must have had some good chats. This idea hasn't fared terribly well either. I think Schumacher would have been charmed by the way that we've started to gather information on things like eco-footprinting, the circular economy, that allow us to actually do the sums and make good decisions. I think he would have been significantly less impressed by what the sums actually show us. We are living way beyond our means. There are currently 139 countries using more than one planet, which leaves 20 using the equivalent of one planet, or a bit less. And at this current rate of development, we're well on the way to using 4 planets. It's good when you do the sums, isn't it? And the last time I looked, we still just had the one. Is it inevitable? I don't know. I'm not sure it is. Barbara Ward wasn't on Howard's list. It was, to be fair, work in progress, and I suspect that as time had gone on, she might just have appeared. She does, however, provide a link to someone that Howard considered himself very, very privileged to have met and spent time with. Barbara Ward wrote Spaceship Earth. Buckminster Fuller wrote the operating manual for Spaceship Earth 2 years later. How's about that for a second? Buckminster Fuller was an architect, an inventor, a systems theorist, obviously an author. Oddly enough, back in the day, Bucky was seen by some people as a bit of a techno freak, promoting a kind of American high-tech supremacy ideas. And there are actually demonstrations against him at his conferences. Can you imagine that? People beating the door down. Anyway, he developed loads of inventions, including the geodesic dome and the Dymaxion car. He imparted to Howard a lifelong love of don't fight forces, use them. Passive design, simplicity, and a respect for nature. As it happens, at the same time that Howard was meeting Bucky and getting him involved in his lectures, I was in my first year of an engineering degree, and we built a 60-foot geodesic dome out of bamboo and covered it in parachute silk and took it around the festivals. That was us at Glastonbury, circa 1983, I think. I think Bucky would probably have been charmed. The other thing about Buckminster Fuller was that he understood lightweighting, he understood simplification, and he understood that if you actually want things to work with natural forces, you actually have to make them small, light, and put in good controls as well. He would have, I think, been appalled by our inclination to stuff bling on inefficient buildings, sticking solar panels on a heavy goods vehicle. I think he probably was at heart an eco-minimalist, which is a nice thought. The respect for nature led us to a project into understanding how animals build. And very few of them do, actually. Here's one for all you arachnophobes. There you go. This is an interesting one, because despite being a single-celled organism, without any kind of nervous system, a species of amoeba has built a shelter and carries it around with protection. The diameter of this is 150 micrometers. And it's built from grains of sand, which is proof, if you ever needed it, that you don't need brains to be a builder. Anyway, I love that too. From the ridiculously small to the ridiculously large, we have apparently the world's first green skyscraper. Apparently, you've got windows that open right up to the 32nd floor, and it has natural ventilation for 40% of the year. Rah rah. It has, as you notice, also got the same facade through 360 degrees. It's got summer cooling, it's got winter heating. It's very technology rich, and it costs the earth to build. And you contrast it with a little bit more experience from the world of animal building, science rich, cheap to build. And it's got its own air conditioning system and its own food store. So I don't know who the Swiss Re buildings people think they're fooling, but they're not actually fooling the planet, and perhaps that's the thing that we need to be most aware of. What Howard would say, nature can't be fooled. You can't lie to God in your sleep. It doesn't work. Or, as one of Howard's students put it, in a sort of a more professional environment, you can give a lifetime guarantee for every piece of technology that you don't install. Rolf, who said this, is actually designer of the active house. All right? It's a passive house that doesn't have MVHR. Okay? So a passive house has got a fan, ducting, and frost protection. All right? An active house keeps you active by making you open the windows. We can continue to ignore the science and common sense. To me, these ideas have got everything in their favour. And once heard, they can't be unheard. You know, they're part of my professional makeup. And yet, it appears to me that with everything to gain, we're still largely opting for spin instead. I'd like you to give it up for the next of Howard's ingredients for curing the obsession with the C word, and that's Rachel Carson. Yeah. Rachel was famous for drawing attention to the impact of DDT on the natural world. She was pilloried for it in her day. She wasn't looking down her microscope at pandas and tigers. She was looking down at her microscope at the very basic things that actually make up the ecology of our environment. And her book, Silent Spring, and other writings are credited with advancing the global environmental movement. Certainly, nobody was more influential on me in my education. And she predicted many things. She predicted that we would be harming the creatures around us. And I probably heard 40 years ago, if not more, that bees were dying. And every so often, we're encouraged to be nice and butterfly nice. I think she'd be thrilled. I am. One of very few good Millennium projects, I think, and absolutely great. However, professionally, there's still a bit too much of this, isn't there? And this kind of school environment as well. You know, this is actually what we're doing professionally while we're planting butterfly seeds at home. There's not quite enough of this. This is plumber's wood. I think Richard Carson would have liked that. This was Howard and I operating a set of professional values that make absolute sense to us, but actually seem to be marginal and a bit countercultural. We could have this. This is a lovely project in Stroud. Actually, some friends of mine live. That's the regeneration at Fairfield. And this is a school. This is a school playground in Germany. You couldn't do that in Scotland because children would drown running away from the paedophiles. Give it up for Barry Commoner. I had never heard of him. Has anybody heard of him? He was a leading ecologist, and he stood for President of the United States in 1980, based on the 4 unbending laws of ecology. He also wrote a book called The Closing Circle. If, as Commoner suggested, everything must go somewhere, then the VOCs on those walls and in the air freshener have gone into the lungs of the children using those toilets, because actually we're using really lousy materials and we design our ventilation system so badly that we have to cover up the lack of ventilation. There has been a vast expansion in the use of different sorts of materials and consequently in the use of toxic building materials. We still know very, very, very little about the effect of these on ourselves and on the environment, and we certainly know absolutely zip about the cocktail effect. And yet, in our professional lives, we still routinely coat timber with copper, horrible toxic materials, to protect it from decomposition, thereby turning it into toxic waste. I think actually what I'd like to do at this point is just to acknowledge the role that CEDA has had in this health debate in Scotland. It's had a really, really positive influence, and we've made huge inroads in terms of events and publications. And I particularly like to mention another very early member of CEDA alongside Christina and Howard, and that's Jed Pemberton, who died this year. And I just want to mention Jed organised many CEDA events back in the 90s, one of which was this fabulous thing which was called Vital Building Syndrome. And Jed had this lovely way of communicating the things that we needed to do. He actually managed to get Patch Adams, the one played by Robin Williams, you know, cheery Robin Williams, who was a surgeon, a doctor, and an amazing guy and a comedian, to come over to the States and talk about working in hospitals. It was absolutely fabulous. Jed's events were always creative, they were always positive, and they were always fabulously funny. I hope that Howard's memorial lectures will not lose that. I think it's very important that we deal with these issues in a very positive way. The work on environment and dealing with toxins has actually been taken up on an urban scale, so you get places like Freiburg and Tübingen, where the master plan actually writes in that we won't have any nasty stuff. And amazingly enough, loads of stuff still gets built. It doesn't stop them building stuff. I find it surprising that we just don't seem able to follow this trail that has been blazed. There are some examples of dealing with a circular economy in circular cities in terms of design, with cooling being used for the housing, but using compost, taking for biofuels. It's not perfect. The Hammerbill model is far from perfect, but it's a start. People starting to think this way Because once you start to think this way, you have to design the toxins out of the system, because once they're in, you'll never get them out. And work that Gaia International did as well, this integration of looking at the relationship between the city and the hinterland, because they will always inevitably be connected. I think what Commoner probably didn't predict was that everything must go somewhere would become everything must go anywhere. We see government quangos and actually some people very much at the forefront of the environmental movement routinely promoting recycling of toxic waste into the built environment as yet more products. I think it's a bit way past the time that we needed to unpick this. And we need to tell the drinks industry and the car industry to go and sort out their own waste and redesign, redevelop their products. It's not just a responsibility for us, and while we accept this kind of stuff into the built environment, they will not deal with it. It will become our problem. I think Commoner probably did predict the oceanic soup. This is the plastic garbage floating in vast areas of the world's oceans. This image is actually taken from a wonderful book which is called Cause and Effect, and what it depicts is more than 500 pieces of plastic debris that have been found in the digestive tract of an albatross chick. Dead, naturally. Yeah. So when the British Plastics Federation start banging on about the fact that this is not their problem, it's all to do with us, I think we should give them short shrift. Alternatives exist. Indeed, other products are available. I've so far failed to find any situation, material or design solution that can't get rid of a toxin. There is always an alternative. But again, if you bother to go to B&Q, you will recognise the enormity of the uphill struggle and the way that we're simply transferring the economic liability of all these products onto the future as a matter of course. That's what we do. Which brings me to ingredient number 6, Ian McHarg. Ian McHarg understood this. Good environmental design is good economics. He pioneered the concept of ecological planning, and his book Design with Nature is still an absolute classic, widely celebrated book on landscape architecture and land use planning. It defined all sorts of problems of modern development and also proposed solutions compatible with them. It probably laid the foundation for environmental impact assessment and also regenerative design. I think McHarg would have liked something like the regenerative design proposals for Emscher Park. This is a project in northern Germany which was an economic regeneration project. It had 17 towns going across the north of Germany which were blighted by a loss of industry, because it had all gone to India and China, and increasing deprivation, and that was leading to racial tensions between the native population and the long-term economic migrants. And the whole project was driven as a design proposal from the landscape up. And it's fabulous, and it's become a tourist destination. I think McHarg would have liked the way that, actually in the very best of developments, the way that things were developed into community developments. He'd have been charmed, I think, by the approach taken to development in Berlin and Malmö, which has now set guidelines on the percentage of biodiverse rich landscape that must accompany development proposals. So you're getting development, but you're also getting bits between the development. You're getting the spaces between. Places you actually would want to be. And enhancing that biodiversity in the waterscape, edible landscape, putting people first and cars way, way down the line. Ian McHarg also said something else. He said, man is a blind, witless, lowbrow, anthropocentric clod who inflicts lesions upon the earth. To be fair, it's difficult to argue with that. To ingredient number 7. And Sherry Arnstein was the only person I could not get a photograph of. She's remembered for her pioneering work on what's called the ladder of participation. It's got 8 rungs, and each rung on that represents a higher degree of citizen power. Okay? She labelled the 2 lowest rungs manipulation and therapy as non-participation. The aim of this kind of consultation is in fact the assumption that the proposed plan is the best, and the job of a participation process is just to get public support by public relations. Yeah, we all know lots of these. And the next step up to 3 is informing. It's an important step to legitimate participation, but there's just a one-way flow of information. There's no opportunity for feedback. Rung 4 is consultation. Okay, so that would be neighbourhood meetings, public inquiries. Still feels a bit like window dressing, though, to Arnstein. By 5, rung application. So this is when you've got a few hand-picked worthies who are co-opted onto committees. And this allows some citizens, to advise on the planning, but it still leaves the guys with the power with the right to accept that or not. Ignore the legitimacy of their advice if they choose. Now we're on to 6. We're on to something more like a partnership. This is where you get power redistributed through negotiation between the citizens and the power holders. So it's shared. You've got joint committees. At 7, you've got citizens holding a clear majority of seats. And they've got powers to make decisions as well. So actually, they can make sure that the powers that be are accountable to them rather than the other way around. And at the top of the ladder, you've got complete citizen control. So you've got the have-nots handling the whole job with no separation, getting access to the money through any third party. Direct line. Fabulous piece of work. Absolutely fabulous piece of work. Our experience of this level of working with people and communities, I think probably Howard's best experience of this would be the transformation of the Fairfield estate from this in the early 80s. This was with Drew Mackey, his partner in Gaia Planning, and others, to something more like that. What they did there was they actually trained up the population who were currently living there to be able to employ architects and advisors. They very nearly lost their first job, and they definitely lost some of the phases of the project, 6, 7, 8, I think. But that was very much enabling the community there to take full control and have power. Probably the last housing co-op to be developed in Scotland, I think it probably was. There's another project that we worked on. I know, never worked with animals or children, we did it all. This project came about because, and Kathy's here who runs the Eco-City project as well, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding was that Kathy wrote the RIS to say that they wanted to work with children on built environment issues. And they asked if they could find some architects who'd be willing to work with them on built environment issues. And only one architect responded. Yep, that was Howard. And it involves working with children over a period of days on their local environment with neighbouring schools to allow them to make decisions about their community, quite often as part of a planning and consultation process. So they get creative discussions, it engages their parents over a period of 5 days. And as you can see, they get really involved in all of this. They're fabulous designers, put it all together, they work together. And on the last day, actually, all the adults who've been working with them to facilitate this process stand back and allow the children to present it. I'm still, myself, trying to figure out at what stage, where this fits on Arnstein's ladder. In the best hands, it's potentially a fabulous development tool. It would be a shame if, in the hands of developers, it ends up being tokenist. Has it really changed the lives of people in Drumchapel and in Halifax? It's affected give children power, and it affected their parents, and it certainly affected their teachers. There's one teacher in Craigmillar who actually said at the end of the process that she'd been teaching in Craigmillar for 17 years and she never realised her children had so much potential. I personally wanted to kill her. Wrong job, love, wrong job. In the hands of the right developers with the right aspirations, it remains a fabulous tool. But that is kind of the problem. If you want a system to be resilient, you need to engage people in determining their own needs. At the moment, most development is developer-led, and it's simply a branch of banking, if you hadn't noticed. If it's community-led, then actually it's solving real needs. And I do question whether or not in 2015 simply giving people the choice of their kitchen finish is really, really quite enough. Yeah. I don't think we're ready for patting ourselves on the back just yet. This is an example of a schools project that we visited in Germany, which had actually had the children participating as well, and the fabulous sense of design quality and ownership. You can smell it. You can absolutely smell it. And then there's examples in landscape as well. One of Howard's favourites was the Kuhlenberg project, where the housing was put in, and the landscape was then waited until everybody had actually moved in and was done as a participative exercise. There are some nice examples. This is another one. This is the kind of building that people think that I work on when I say that I work in environmental building. Personally, I love it. It was built by a group of disaffected youth in northern Germany. Those disaffected youth now have their own disaffected youth, and they haven't burnt it down yet. They own it. They live, and played a cracking game of pool with Howard in there as well. And the other thing that it enabled them to do in taking ownership and self-building that as a community centre for themselves was they learnt skills. So we're back to that good work, creativity, that synergy that goes back to Schumacher as well. Which brings me to James Lovelock, the only one still alive. I was going to wear all my friends are dead t-shirt today, but I didn't know. English, he's best known for proposing the Gaia hypothesis. He also was a fabulous inventor. He was the guy who actually developed the measuring device, which actually identified nasty toxins in the breast milk of mothers. This is a guy who really did his sums. So the Gaia hypothesis postulates the Earth functions as a self-regulating system. Lovelock's pretty hard-headed when it comes to humankind, but it was, after all, the Gaia hypothesis, the Green Association of Idealistic Architects, apparently, and that's the mission of Gaia International. Now, to be frank, when Howard was putting together EcoMax, this was the only hero that I didn't and couldn't share. I did wonder at one point whether or not, having developed the Gaia hypothesis, much other good, Howard just couldn't kick him out of bed, despite the pro-nuclear stuff that actually we found pretty unsupportable. However, it's taken the writing of this lecture to properly understand that actually Lovelock may be the closest in spirit to all of his heroes. He's controversial. Many of you will know that Howard could be very uncomfortable. Oh yes, he's kicked many of us. Like Howard, he was always prepared to say what he needed to say. He was prepared to say that we can create a radical change to a direction towards genuine improvement for everybody. But it might not be doing what makes you feel comfortable. You might have to get out of your comfort zone for that to happen. Howard created a lot of controversy when he wrote Eco-Minimalism. A lot of people were really cross. They'd just got that eco-blame, and they thought that was the Godhead. He made people cross because he got really, really angry at the God is Passive House brigade, because everybody kind of got there and stopped. And so I think that's what makes him feel closer. The idea that actually, even when you think you've found the answer, maybe you just have to try harder and look a bit deeper. Something else emerges that I want to mention as a consequence of the Limits to Growth report, and that is that, in my opinion, it's not about the amount of stuff. It's not about the cars or the products or the babies that is the limiting factor in the system. It's actually the amount of resource, food, that baby consumes during its lifetime, and the amount of pollution that it generates. for baby substitute car. We know there are good cars and bad cars. We know that one Indian baby is different from an American baby. In fact, we know an Indian baby is very different from another Indian baby in terms of the resources they use and the waste they produce. So don't blame the babies. There are ways that we can close the circle on this, design the toxins out and make sure that we minimise that primary resource use and that waste and pollution to create a closed circle. This, to me, is a designer's dream. There are limits to growth, but there are no limits to development. Whippy! I've tried to demonstrate that optimism is worthwhile. There has been change, and I hope I made you think in your own heads about some of the good news. The Marylebone Road doesn't look like this anymore. Yeah? There are people actively taking action. But we all have choices to make. Whether it's each pound we spend as an indication of the kind of world that we want. It's not yet too late to choose the intelligent path over the unsufferably arrogant one. EcoMax was work in progress, an attempt to keep our eye on the big picture. It discusses facts, and what I've relayed through Howard's Heroes is, on the scale of my lifetime, a long history of missed opportunities. I've recounted 60 years of bad ideas dominating good ideas, of A-class thinkers elbowed into the undergrowth to make way for B-class thinkers. They may not have led us to break yet, but the bad guys are winning. Ecological, social, and sensible economic planning is still marginalised and largely perceived as countercultural. I personally did not set out in my career to be countercultural and on the margins, and neither did Howard. We actually set out to do that, making a difference thing. And we tried to make a difference based on the good ideas we heard, and once we'd heard them, we couldn't unhear them. They were part of our makeup. Does it matter? Well, yes, I think it does, actually. Where are we now in the destructive testing debate? Are we in the elastic region? Do we have the ability to bounce back? I suspect in Rachel Carson's time that in terms of biodiversity, we probably were actually in the elastic region, and I suspect we're not now. There may be issues which we still have to confront, where we have to make a decision that stops us moving from the elastic to the plastic and breaking the system. Those debates are probably still to come at us. But what seems to be clear that it's not that we don't have the right ideas. It's just that when we're faced with a fork in the road, the good ideas seem to lose out and only have kudos in a kind of countercultural forum. We need to communicate better. There are positives, but there aren't that many, and frankly, I'm a bit impatient. Always have been, always will be. Apart from a few rare examples, it's the bad and the least resilient ideas that get replicated, and we appear pretty incompetent to make the right decisions. So, with Howard sitting on our shoulders and kicking us in the butt, I want to invite you to look to the light at the end of the tunnel, to freely argue the concepts and ideas that I've put forward and things that you think are opportunities and missed opportunities, and to think about how we might put these forward as professional values and help us to communicate them as ethical, important facts, not peripheral ones. I'd like to encourage you to be more radical, more green, with a little bit less head and a lot more heart. I'd like you to give it up for the heroes as well. I'd like to imagine a better future, and I'd like you to look forward to some consensus in our values towards a proper human ecology. Thank you.